If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Lore by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the Masquerade. In this episode, we continue the Lore by Night How to Vampire series, a mini-series that aims to improve the role-playing of players and storytellers during tabletop sessions. This episode will focus on world building. If there is one thing that anyone in the tabletop role-playing game community can agree on, the task of world building is just as important as any of the supporting cast, whether it is the players themselves or the seemingly endless supplies of NPCs generated by the games master. All Dungeons & Dragons game masters are essentially knockoff novel writers, which is probably why they are referred to as storytellers in World of Darkness games. I believe this is the best title for one who runs these sorts of games. TTRPGs are, in my mind at least, a collaborative effort between player and games master, an ad-lib play of sorts, but we will explore that later on. Running a game isn't easy, whether it is a one-shot or a series of sessions that lasts for months or even years. It can be overwhelming to be put behind the screen of rules and numbers and present the world you have created and pray it is going to be good enough for your players to enjoy. Where does one even begin to plan such a thing? No doubt you are aware there are literally hundreds of YouTube pages and forum posts on the internet that answer such questions and more. The fault I find that many of these have is that they pull hypothetical examples from their assholes, places that are filled with ifs, buts and maybes, but not providing anything concrete, which is just as helpful as it is confusing. Very few posts and videos on world building use actual examples of games that people have run. You can probably see where I'm going with this by now, but just in case you don't, allow me to put it plainly. I aim to present to you how I would approach the mammoth task that is world building by using an actual example that you can watch right now on the World of Darkness YouTube channel, an actual play one-shot called Rip the Ripper. On the 19th of December 2020, I was invited to storytell a Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition one-shot on the World of Darkness Twitch channel as part of their Family Holiday Christmas event. Most games of Vampire the Masquerade are focused on a darker version of the modern night, but my one-shot took place in the Victorian era period, specifically set in London, when the players were tasked to stop the infamous Jack the Ripper, hence the title, Rip the Ripper. It was one of the most popular actual plays during the Family Holiday event, gaining some of the most views both on Twitch and YouTube, and the VTM community in general, as it garnered excited feedback from the fans of the game, all wanting more of this setting and cast. But before I properly sink my fans into this episode, I wish to clarify two things. First, whilst this episode is aimed primarily at storytellers of the World of Darkness games, Vampire the Masquerade in particular, that does not mean this information can't be used in other games and systems. I am also aware that tonight's case study is a one-shot and not a full chronicle, so I will address certain elements as and when required. Second, whilst there are ultimately no right or wrong ways to plan and deliver a tabletop role-playing game session, unless it is going out of its way to deliberately harm and upset players, you didn't come here for anyone's opinion. You came here for mine, and I am certainly no deity on the matter. As such, all thoughts and opinions are my own, so if you disagree with something I have said, that is totally fine. It does not mean that you are right and I am wrong, and vice versa. Now, let us discuss the Promethean task that is world building. The very first thing I do when I am planning a session is to remind myself what world building actually means. To look at it quite literally, it involves you building a world. Now, this may seem incredibly obvious, but if we were to take a deeper look at this, there are lots of things to consider. It involves far more than the geography, but the people that live there, the cultures they have, the civilizations they have built, what they eat, drink, hunt, and copulate with. Players of more fantasy-focused games such as The Witcher, Shadowrun, and Dungeons & Dragons have to focus on all of these elements the most, especially the latter, where it is encouraged for dungeon masters to conjure their own fantasy realms and do as they please. This too applies to games that are still grounded in reality, such as the World of Darkness games and Call of Cthulhu, for example. They may have strong fantasy elements, but even the weird and macabre creatures operate in a certain fashion. The denizens of the World of Darkness, the likes likes of vampires, werewolves, etc., all have sentience. They have their own cultures, hierarchies, and politics they adhere to. I am fairly certain the same can be said for the other games I have mentioned so far. This is, of course, assuming that the storyteller wishes to stick to the canon material, which is totally fine. There is nothing wrong with this, but perhaps change things up a little bit? Not every harpy in Vampire the Masquerade has to be a Toreador, and neither does every prince has to be a Ventrue. Yes, many of the canonical princes usually are Ventrue, but only a small portion of the world has been covered by the official books. Even so, you don't have to adhere to that. The sheriffs, hounds, and the other hunting titles don't have to be given the more violent clans such as the Gangrel, the Bruja, and Banu Hakim, assuming that we are using the V5 system when the Assamites are part of the Ivory Tower. Sure, you can use your knowledge on clan lore to help you define a character for a given title, but don't solely think about the clans and their powers, the crunch, so to speak. They do not speak to who and what the person is. Even with a one-shot, where progression is rather limited, it is possible to have this amount of flexibility. Sticking to the game's lore religiously is far more harmful than it is good. That doesn't mean throwing the whole rulebook out of the window, that's just silly. Just tiny changes in the game's established canon can be enough to excite players and throw them off edge. Similarly, you should allow your players to create concepts that break stereotypes. I would actually say the only time you should stop someone playing a character if it is blatantly offensive. For example, in Rip the Ripper, 2 of the 5 players wanted to play vampire clans that really should not have been allowed to exist in the game's setting for a variety of lore reasons. In Victorian London, Prince Mithras expelled the Setite clan, known in V5 as the Ministry, and the clan Tremere for reasons I cannot be bothered to talk about right now. Now, I could have stopped these 2 for playing these clans simply to adhere to the lore, but I asked myself what their absence would have done to the game. Did I plan using these clans as antagonists? No. In short, absolutely nothing would have been gained if I made them play something else. Furthermore, the Tremere player did not have the infamous blood sorcery exclusive to the clan, but Oblivion instead, which essentially boils down to Eldritch Horror meets Necromancy. This would not have made sense, but I was so blown away by the character's concept that I decided to let it stay, because that made for a far more intriguing story than keeping them with the stereotype. Let your players be creative with character concepts. Their creativity will encourage your creativity. I said earlier on that tabletop role-playing games are ad-lib dramas, by which I mean it is an improvised acting session. Everyone is the star and everyone is the director during the game, and no star shines brighter than anyone else. Yes, the storyteller has the final say on decisive matters, but that is not the point I am making here. For the most part, it will be the players driving the plot forward, so let them exist in the world you are creating, not just as a passenger who is occasionally interacting with the world around them. Give consequences to their actions. If your players choose to slaughter a pub for the lols, have them arrested or initiate some sort of chase sequence by the authorities, put a bounty on their head or something. If there is a time-sensitive matter they must adhere to, but decide to go fishing instead, make it known they have just fucked up. This can also include players taking too long to make a decision. If a player has presented you an extensive backstory of their character, their family, education, preferred pronouns, the contact, enemies, lover, and the great Aunt Bertha's pet mountain chicken Reginald, adhere to them religiously. These characters and motives now exist in your world and are pivotal in getting your players to believe your world is believable, which should be the end goal for any storyteller. They can be quest givers or means of moving the plot forward through things that they have said and done. Also, as you take into consideration how to incorporate their backstories, actually ask your players what they want to see and experience in game. It is no good planning a stealthy sneakathon filled with political intrigue if all they want to do is beat up some dragons. Obviously, this works slightly differently with one-shots, as the players have to kinda agree on a given one-shot, but some of this still applies. Consent in gaming is very important also, as discussed in my Consent in Gaming episode. Some people call this session 0, some people just have a good old chin wag before playing, some new sheets to fill out, others don't. There's no wrong way of doing this. However you do it, make sure everyone is happy and comfortable with what is about to transpire and check up on them regularly. Of course, these people and quests cannot exist in a vacuum, unless of course your game is in space. Land, sea or forest, they must build and thrive somewhere, and no matter how fantastical it may seem on the surface, every piece of fantasy and sci-fi is grounded and originates from reality. Star Wars is ultimately a spaghetti western with space magic, where our space cowboys are fighting against a fascist regime. No, I won't be taking questions at this time. Strange pot-stirring arguments aside, think of your senses. What does your world smell, feel, look and sound like? Can you taste the dirty air? Does it smell clinically clean? Is it soft and safe? Or do those prison bars feel cold and dank? Images probably stir in your head as I toss those examples around, which is exactly what a decent S tier will do. Make the players feel that they are actually there, make them feel cold when it snows, make them sweat when they are in the desert, make them lust for the sun again when they are deep underground in a moist cave. This actual construction of the world is what I feel a lot of people stumble on, as their infinite gulf that is the imagination can provide too much inspiration. Using one's senses is vital, but that doesn't help much if you don't know what a city should look and sound like. As I said previously, everything is based on something that already exists, which is far more useful for game masters that run games that have more fantasy settings. Cyberpunk settings, for example, are fueled by the concept of low-life high-tech, built upon American and Japanese racial tensions and influences each culture has in architecture and fashion. Fantasy settings often stem from the medieval period or the Dark Ages, depending on who you ask, and the various myths and superstitions created by its residents. The lesser well-known and yet equally cool setting that is steampunk would not exist without the technology and aesthetic designs inspired by 19th century industrial steam-powered machinery, which leads me back to my Victorian age Vampire the Masquerade one-shot. When preparing Rip the Ripper, capturing the feel of Victorian London was the most important detail I felt I could not fail in. Everything else could have been a total train wreck as far as I was concerned, but if I managed to get the players to feel what Victorian London was like, I did an alright job as a storyteller. All but one of the players was American, the remaining one was in Europe, so that knowledge was not immediately apparent. That isn't to say that every person in the UK are walking encyclopedias on British history, but I wanted to remove any stereotypes these Yanks and the European had been presented with thanks to Hollywood and video games. So how did I do this? Well, in short, I did a lot of fucking research. I spent hours wading through articles and documentaries, absorbing as much information I could about Victorian life and culture to get a feel what it was like for all sorts of people. It is very easy for those across the pond, the Americans, to assume all of us Brits are tea-drinking toffs that play cricket and speak in Queen's English. This isn't entirely true. Down at the core, the lower classes are all geezers, innit? Dirty, grimy bastards with a bit of ooh, bit of way. We're not all posh. Polite maybe, but not posh. Being a tale about Jack the Ripper, I focused my research on the infamous Whitechapel, one of the most violent and roughest streets in all of England at this time, and that is excluding Jack's murderous escapades. I researched his crimes and researched the living conditions in the overcrowded streets. I tried finding out how disgusting London sewers were and was just surprised by how large they actually were, and the horror stories I found about children getting lost down there, as well as the many ludicrous stories of zoo animals like alligators and making themselves at home there. I even went to go so far as to find the actual weather report for the game's year, which was 1891. The end result was a 3-minute opening monologue employing all of my research into the 5 senses from all perspectives of life in one generalised yet detailed account of my version of Victorian London within the World of Darkness universe. Granted, not much of London was actually explored in the game, but one of the more consistent pieces of feedback I got from both the players and the viewers of the one-shot is that they loved my descriptions of the environments. They felt a part of the setting. I consider that mission accomplished. Don't you? Oh, and because my regular podcast listeners are probably curious about the Victorian Age Vampire the Masquerade book, yes, it was something I purchased in addition to its companion guide. Both were very helpful. I also used Kindred of the Ebony Kingdom to provide stats for the hippo, just in case someone wanted to pick a fight with it. It is highly likely that many of you listening to this are very much overwhelmed with the amount of information I've just presented to you, especially in that final bulk about my research. If I have, Good, because it means you've been paying attention. World building is hard, there is no denying that. It is also incredibly fun, far more so than creating the big evil baddie, their 68 goons and grumpy merchant number 324. Even when running predetermined modules require some level of research, which is basically just reading the book. The various by-night books for the World of Darkness games have enough for anyone to feel they are part of a city, but I do think additional research is required to add to the authenticity of your setting. Take your time to love your setting, watch your world grow and absorb your players into it. Make everyone feel that they belong there, not as spectators. If your players can see and feel the love and energy you put into it, they will too. Sitting on your ass panicking whether your players will hate your game or stressing out because you don't know what to do and how to do isn't going to get your game started. Just fucking do it already, alright? To be kept updated, follow the Lore by Night VTM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we will upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.